Hi everyone. Today we are joined by Professor Geoffrey Roberts, a British historian, and with many books. And one of the more recent ones is this one, Stalin's Library, which is I guess one of my favorites. So welcome back to the program.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Greg. Good to see you again. By the way, you're talking about Stalin's Library. Well, this is the paperback edition, which has just been published. Yeah, fantastic cover, eh?
All right, it looks good.
Okay.
Well, well, it's good that you're a historian because often. Well, history belongs into politics has always been one of my concerns. That when you look at the work of international relations, was 60 years ago, half of it would be historical accounts. These days, it's kind of missing, which is why you lose an important component. On the other hand, when politicians bring up history, we tend to see it being used in more creative ways. That is, history is used or misused often to serve political objectives, but also form identities. So I always tend to be skeptical when our politicians refer to history, especially during war, as the history then becomes especially creative. And when we look at the Ukraine war, of course, doesn't only apply to one side. It seems, yeah. Shifting history according to how it fits is something everyone would be guilty of. Um, but I was wondering if you can, maybe, if we can pick your brain on this a bit, because I want to see how you see Russia then, because it tends to refer a lot to World War II, obviously, and the war it's fighting at the moment. I even see some towns which were been taken, they even rise a Soviet flag. There used to be more of that before, not so much anymore. But what do you read into this? The leaning into the World War II history on the Russian side, that is, during this war.
Yeah. Well, of course, historians always try to appropriate history and use it for their own political purposes. There's nothing new about that. I tend to agree that they do it more today than they did in the past. Some historians like actually assist them in that process of misappropriation, and there's other historians who can contest it and see their role as correcting, and presenting alternative views to politically manipulated versions of the past. Yeah, and we've certainly seen that big time in the context of the Ukraine war. So, okay, we have what you might call like current narratives about the war, but we also have coexisting alongside them, connected to them, historical narratives, right? And it's the combination of the background historical narrative and the current narrative, which makes them so powerful and compelling. And the most ubiquitous example of that, of course, is we have this historical narrative about the 1930s about Hitler and appeasement. Yeah, very simplistic narrative, wrong in so many ways. And also, by the way, it's not a narrative you'll find in any history books. Yeah, even the crudest history books have a more sophisticated view of Hitler, appeasement, and all of that than espoused in by politicians and by the mass media. Okay, but
Actually,
it's
can we can you take a few moments on how you see this period, because that is an important part, because it appears that our politicians in the West, they seem to forever live in the 1930s. And again, it's an important narrative because if you lean into this history, then negotiations is always appeasement, and war is the solution, which is why we always bring up Munich when we're going to sell a war to the public. But you said that this history itself is perverted to some extent. I
yeah,
heard
sure.
Jeffrey Sachs say the same thing. Well, how do you feel the Munich history has
Yeah.
been manipulated?
But let me just finish the point I was trying to
Sorry.
make there. It's when you combine that historical narrative, crude though it is, misleading it is, with a current narrative, right? That's what makes the powerful the powerful combination. So you have the argument about Hitler and appeasement and where appeasement leads to, and you have a different version of that argument in the current situation where they point to recent events. Yes. Yeah, the events we're living through as being of a similar character in the past. So it's the combination of the historical and contemporary narrative, which I think makes them so compelling and powerful and so useful from a political political point of view. Now, okay, you can pick apart that narrative, contest that narrative, which I've done, you've done, many people have done as well. And you can pick apart the historical bit, and you can pick apart the current bit, and basically you need to do both. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make, we need to recognise how powerful that narrative is and has been, yeah, in shaping political action in relation to Western political action, and also to a certain extent, lesser extent, but to a certain extent, public opinion, popular perceptions of what's been going on in the war. Okay, but to go back to your question, yeah, okay, so look, where does one start? You know, I mean, you know, just my starting point is usually this: is that Hitler, sorry, Putin is not like Hitler. You know, Hitler was a Nazi, a racist, a genocide. Hitler wanted war. That was his whole outlook, his whole political orientation. Hitler didn't want to be appeased. Hitler is none of those things. Sorry, Putin is none of those things. What Putin is both an appeaser and someone who wants to be appeased. Because how else can you explain Putin's actions in trying to resolve the Ukraine crisis peaceably after its outbreak in 2014, his actions to sort of like try and prevent war and arrive at a security settlement, his actions once the war has started in trying to arrive at some kind of peace deal, and his current actions in being willing to negotiate to negotiate an end to the war. Okay, it's on his terms, so on Russian terms, it has to take into account what's happening in the war, but nevertheless, he's prepared. He's prepared to make a compromise peace, right? Okay, so Putin, the politician who wanted to be appeased, and I suppose the second general historical point is this: is that there's nothing wrong in principle with appeasement, hence who you're appeasing, and for what purposes. And the problem with appeasing Hitler was he didn't want to. He didn't want to be appeased, and it put off a kind of the inevitability of a confrontation with Hitler in the late 1930s. Now, there are some historians who will argue actually putting off that confrontation wasn't such a bad thing. Actually, it did serve a purpose. But the critique of 1930s appeasement was that it was misconceived in its view of Hitler and its view of the possibilities of making peace with Hitler. But that doesn't make appeasement in general wrong. Winston Churchill position at the time was he was against appeasing Hitler, but he was also in favor of appeasing Stalin. Churchill wanted to appease Stalin. He was in favor of a grand alliance of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union to oppose Hitler. And of course, during the Second World War itself, there was a grand alliance involving the United States and other countries. And at the heart of that grand alliance was Western appeasement of Stalin for the purposes of winning the war. And if we go to the end of the war, Stalin was prepared to engage in the appeasement of the West to a certain extent as part of his project of post-war peaceful coexistence and the continuation of the Grand Alliance after the war. So there's nothing inherently wrong with appeasement. Appeasement actually is a good thing if it avoids war, if it leads to peace. So the historical lesson for our times is this: is that we desperately need appeasement now. That's what we need. We need appeasement. We need appeasement of Putin, and also to a certain extent, looking at it from the other perspective, there has to be a degree of appeasement of Ukrainian nationalism as well, in order to bring about some kind of peace settlement.
You know, that's a good point. This radical anti-appeasement, if you will. I heard this for I started to think about it, yeah, for a long time. You know, before the Russians invaded and before even the crisis now since 2014, because they kept hearing the argument that when there's a discussion of policy, someone will say, "Well, that's what Putin wants," and then that's kind of like an argument. That's why we can't do it. So why perhaps we shouldn't try to push NATO towards Sweden or Finland back in those days? And you said, well, that would be very provocative to Russia. Well, of course that's what Putin wants, as if this is in the security dilemma. You do want to take into consideration your opponents. The whole idea that we should that is a good thing to ignore the security or concern of your opponents. It's very strange. Sometimes you want to reassure, you want to appease. So I guess that's a
It,
good
it, it,
point.
it, it's actually human behavior that creates the security dilemma. There's nothing inherent, I don't think anyway, there's nothing inherently existential about there being a security dilemma between states, right? It's created by perceptions and actions. And the way you end security dilemmas is changing your view, changing your actions. And many instances. I mean, the most recent big instance of it, of course, is how Gorbachev collapsed the security dilemma of the Cold War, didn't he? By changing Western perceptions, also by changing Soviet society. His program of reform, and that process continued in the 1990s to a certain extent.
No, indeed. He's often brought up as an example to how to mitigate security time because he actually made a lot of statements pointing out that, well, maybe more weapons doesn't make us more safe because it only provokes a counter reaction from the West. So we will
Uh,
do this unilateral drawdown and then the West will relax more. And this was seen as being the path to peace. So, but this is also then appeasement, I guess.
Yeah, sure, yeah, and of course, in the post-Cold War period, the post-Soviet period, the Russian Federation on many occasions attempted to use your phrase, mitigate the security dilemma by setting up common security arrangements in Europe, right up until the outbreak of the Ukraine war in February 22. The Russian side was trying to negotiate with the West a set of common security arrangements, deal with security issues on both sides, as well as, of course, the position of Ukraine.
Yeah, well, on the topic of history, the 1990s is a fascinating time because it's not really ancient history, but it's history nonetheless that has seems to have been forgotten completely. If you go back to the 1990s, it appeared that all state leaders in the United States and Europe we were all talking about the same thing, the security architecture and what would it mean to expand NATO? Would we be canceling the agreements for inclusive security architecture? Would we revive the Cold War logic? Would we alienate the Russians? Would we, yes, set ourselves up for a conflict down the road? I mean, even the people who are for and against NATO expansion, and there were a lot against for this reason, but
Sure.
even the people who were for it recognized the problem. But these days, if you do mention NATO expansion as something provocative which destabilizes, it's denounced immediately as a Kremlin talking point or Russian
Yeah, yeah,
propaganda. How do you see this history? How
yeah,
is it possible that it just went from being, it's in all the textbook, all the quotations, all the people, but now suddenly
yeah,
overnight it got stamped with this Russian
yeah,
propaganda and we don't talk about it.
yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to say about the way people respond to criticisms of NATO expansion. I mean, that's another thing that strikes me about current narratives in relation to the Ukraine war. Well, two things: how intolerant and dogmatic they are. Yeah, they won't brook no criticism or alternative views. Yeah, um, and resort to personal attacks as a way of fending off criticism, but also their lack of reflexivity, self-reflexivity, the lack of awareness of that they are. It is a story they're telling, and what the nature of that story is, and and what the problems there might be with the story. Okay, but going back to the 90s, I thought Jonathan Haslam's latest book, whose titles escapes me at the moment, despite the fact that I did a review. Yeah,
Hubris.
yeah, Hubert. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. He thought made an important point. I don't think it was a particular original point, but it certainly impressed itself upon me, which is that in the 1990s, early to mid 1990s, the European leaders basically wanted to do what the Russians wanted, more or less. They wanted to establish some common security arrangements. They assumed that now the Cold War is over, now Russia had changed, or not just Russia, but the whole Soviet Union collapsed, and the Russian Federation was now capitalistic and democratic. That there would be a new security space and set of arrangements and institutions in Europe. Right. So that's the European perspective. The American perspective was they wanted the continuation of the existing structures, i.e., basically of NATO, right? Because it was through the existence of NATO that gave the Americans leverage in European context, right? And not only that, they saw the expansion of NATO as being an extension of that leverage, which is why it's on the American side. Okay, there is opposition to it, of course, on the American side as well. But that's why it's, the driving force of NATO expansion, if you're talking about the West, Western Europe and the United States, comes from the United States, not from Western Europe. Of course, the countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they want to become members of NATO for their own reasons, but the driving force of it comes from the United States. And of course, the other part of the context is Russia is very, very weak. It's in a very precarious position. The Americans can actually to sideline the Russians, to ignore the Russians, to not be too concerned about what their sensibilities are in relationship. They have the luxury of being able to afford choosing, making partners with Poland, the Baltic states, other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, rather than pursuing a serious partnership. A serious partnership with Russia. So yeah, yeah, okay. We're in a particular moment now, which one of the fundamental things that has shaped this one has been the expansion of NATO and the changing character of NATO, and obviously how that's impacted on relations with Russia. But there's nothing inevitable about that. I mean, that was a matter of political choices made in the 1990s. There were alternative paths that could have been trodden, and there still exist. There still exist alternative paths. Okay, more difficult to find, more difficult to actually travel across for sure. But still, though, the possibilities that were present in the 1990s, to a certain extent, in many ways, exist today.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying though,
So I suppose the message I'm getting: don't be a prisoner of history.
no.
Just because stuff has happened in the past in a particular way doesn't mean to say it was either inevitable in the past or it's inevitably going to be repeated in the present or in the future. Sorry.
No, but the past is important if you want to identify why we're in the mess we are. So, for example, on NATO expansion, as you said, it was seen as opportunistic because Russia was weak. It was getting weaker. There was no need to take its security concerns into account. I mean, this is what many people in the Clinton administration recognized as well. So this is yeah, Russia's weak, so we can instead pursue this hegemonic path for NATO and a hegemonic model for European security. However, once that decision was made, it looks as if we dressed it all up in ideology. That is, that this was a big peace project. And what makes me worried when our politicians start to speak about values as opposed to interests or policies is the values can't be contested. There's always good and bad, and if you contest them domestically as well, you will seen as rejecting these core values. If you don't want to see NATO expansion, well, then you don't care about freedom or democracy. So, but here's my point: is reality is changing. The whole idea that we could expand NATO, we didn't have like what Russia meant, how it would react didn't matter because it was weak and getting weaker. Well, now it's strong and getting stronger. So given that reality change, our policies should change. We should look back to that decision we made in the 90s. Okay, perhaps now we need to address a broken European security architecture. But again, we can't because we had then, banging our head against this ideology and the reference to values. And I keep hearing the reference to narratives all the time now as well. If you say, well, NATO, provoked this war, then they say, well, why is one saying that? Are you supporting the Russian narrative? Are you legitimizing the actions? And suddenly, reality has to take a back seat because we're only now talking about the narrative and the policies which the narratives seems to serve. It's just a very absurd place to be now that objective reality and history no longer, well, it's seen as problematic to the extent it doesn't support the contemporary narrative.
Well, obviously, narratives are nothing new. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean they've always been there, playing the role they be. And I'm a narrative historian, so from my perspective, my particular perspective, human existence is characterized by narrativity. Historians tell stories, write narratives about the past because that's the way history is. That's the way life is like. What's happened in the last 20 or 30 years? There's been a growth in narrative consciousness, isn't it? Yeah, so there's much more explicit talk about and actually identification of narrative. I mean, one good thing about this rise in narrative consciousness has been people are much more acute about identifying not the existence of narratives, and so I think it's sharpened perceptions and it's helped sharpen analysis. I mean, in terms of the current moment, I mean, the current moment is obviously how we got here is quite a complicated story, isn't it? It's not just a question of NATO expansion or of the West and Russia's relations with the West, right? That's one part of the story. The other part of the story, of course, is what's going on in the Soviet Union itself. Yes, right. And then the third part is obviously the very particular story about Russia's relations with Ukraine, and also particularly about what's going on in Ukraine. I mean, let's not underestimate the internal dynamics of the Ukrainian crisis, and indeed of the Ukrainian war. Okay, so it's actually quite a complicated story, and which is very difficult, impossible to grasp, right, to present in terms of some kind of sloganizing narrative. Yeah. What was your other point?
Um, and now,
I'm making you forget now.
no, but I'm actually glad you pivoted a bit into to Ukraine because I do think that this war is it's a regional war. It's been sparked by competition between NATO and Russia,
Sure.
which then manifested itself in a conflict with Ukraine. So again, now it's a proxy, but as you say, one shouldn't lose focus on Ukraine itself. But this is also history seems to take a very important role in let's call it narrative control or in the information war at least, which
Sure.
has become a huge part of this conflict. But what are the main historical issues we are disagreeing on? Because you mentioned before that the nationalists in Ukraine also to some extent have to be appeased. And I often thought that to myself, that one of the mistakes the Russians did was when they kept insisting, we're the one people, we're the same origin, we're all from Kiev and Rus. A key problem behind this is once you say you're the same people, sovereignty becomes, it can be questioned. What's the point of it? So by saying we're the same people all the time, which sounds well to the people in the east of Ukraine, for the people in the west, it can inflame nationalist sentiments because you want to embrace a national identity which shows that you're distinctively different from the other guy. So I guess my point is that perhaps inadvertently, they contributed to fueling some of the nationalist sentiments who, uh, yeah, to support sovereignties, seeking a very radically different identity. I'm thinking
Mm,
then of the Banderites, the more, extreme nationalist, fascist, whatever one wants to call them.
mm.
Um, but anyways, back to my question. What do you see being the main, what are the main historical issues we are discussing when we look at Ukraine?
Well, I've remembered what your other question was, or your other point was, which is about how narratives are typically ideologized, right?
Yes, that's
And
what I
are
was going.
value ridden, yeah, right. Which is, of course, is what makes them so powerful and compelling. Yeah, it's the ideological connotation, not connotation, the ideology and the values that are an integral part of the narrative, which makes them work. Politically. In terms of the Ukraine situation, yeah, okay, so the Ukraine war, okay, it's a proxy war, right? It's a kind of an interstate war between Ukraine and Russia, but it's also a civil war, an internal, like domestic context. And I suppose one of the paradoxes, it's kind of obvious, really, is that the war itself has intensified, the divisions and polarizations within Ukraine itself, and also has actually strengthened kind of like radical elements within Ukraine, and also, as the same is true, it's also strengthened radical elements in Russia. Russia as well. So a military operation which was to what was designed to resolve a security dilemma, you might want to call it, but also at the same time to safeguard the interests and values of pro-Russian elements in Ukraine, has actually had many like many negative outcomes. So presumably Russia. Presumably, I think Russia will win the war. There'll be an outcome which Russia will win in some kind of meaningful sense. But the costs would have been very high, and the long-term like ramifications are kind of immense, and could take generations even to work their way through. But the point about the history, well, I mean, you say to me, "Oh, what do you see the main historical points of issues?" I mean, the problem is, where do you start? I mean, at every single point, the history is consistent. There are alternative views, alternative narratives, alternative sets of facts or versions of the facts, which is why it's like, I mean, I don't know about your experience, but in the past 3 years, I found it very difficult to actually have any kind of proper conversation with pro-Ukrainian supporters in the West, right? Of the extreme kind. It's very difficult because you don't agree on anything at all. Um, so yeah, as I say, where do you start? Yeah, you can start with Kiev and Rus, and the discussion about were they originally one people, or were they separate people? The Ukrainian version of the Kiev and Rus, and the Russian version, and you can come to the present day and all the kind of like different events that have taken place and the different views and spins that are put on on those events. So I would say that Russia's move into Crimea. So yeah, Russia's move into Crimea in 2014 was very much a defensive maneuver, a reactive maneuver, and also happened, at least in part, under the influence of Crimeans themselves, Crimean separatists who actually didn't want to be no part of Ukraine, wanted to be part of Russia, and they seized my moment. So that'd be my kind of like version. Obviously, the contested version would be no. It's all part of Putin's efforts to recreate the Soviet Empire, the Russian Empire, part of Russian expansionism, all of that. All of that kind of keep. Okay, where do you go in that discussion? You start that discussion. Where do you actually go? How do you actually conduct that discussion? Yeah. So I think the incommensurability of narratives and perspectives has been very difficult to handle in relation to the Ukraine war.
Yeah, no, well, I noticed. Yeah, they're the same. They're discussing this issue. For example, on this topic, that it's argued that the Russians are simply after restoring the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
Then didn't react to anything. It was all aggression. But if you ask, well, no Russian leader or no one in Moscow at all were talking about
yeah.
annexing Crimea before the coup. So how does that fit into the story? And then there's nothing. It's there's no response. It's but there's plenty of anger if the narrative, if the ideological narrative is challenged, and not notice I'm jumping back and
Well,
forth,
yeah,
but that goes back to what you said before with these ideological narratives. I think what made it makes it so difficult in the West now to challenge anything that NATO says is
yeah.
because it's been so important to our own identity, to world order, to how we see the world. Because after the Cold War, when we formed, liberal hegemony, which is, the West would dominate, but it would be a benign hegemon. It would benefit the whole world. We would be a force for good. NATO expansion was the manifestation of this idea. That is, we
Mm,
don't need the inclusive security system. We don't need to take into account the security concerns of the Russian. We probably will create a much better security without them. NATO became, yeah, as a manifestation, a state religion almost. We can't. It's impossible to actually criticize what has been done, and it's quite extreme. Um, but on the what history to pick apart, what do you think about Putin's history? Because from Tucker Carlson to the essays he writes, he always delves into his long history, and
mm.
it often gets blanket condemnation in the West. But if you go through the history, it's quite reasonable. I haven't seen. I'm not sure. Of course, it could be self-serving for current interest, but it's how do you see the historical quality, if you will, of what he's writing?
Well, I'm actually on record of saying that Putin is not a bad historian for a politician. Judge, and he's better than most Western politicians as a historian. And that judgment's based on he did an essay on the second origins of the Second World War, right? And also he did a number of speeches in connection with that. So yeah, I've analysed that particular piece he did and his speeches and come to the conclusion that his account of the origin of the Second World War, yeah, is flawed. I think there's problems with it. There's omissions, but it's not a bad piece of history. And the thing about Putin, he's very insistent on 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 being as historical as he can in the sense of relying on evidence, yes, and facts, yes, yeah, not just yeah. So it has to. He's very keen on evidence-driven history. No, I don't. He didn't necessarily. He's not necessarily always successful in that regard, but he kind of insists on what you might call a historian's ethos. And just go back to the point you were making about well, what the different versions of the coup in 2014. Yeah, of course, you might say it's a coup, but other people will say no, it wasn't a coup. It was a popular revolution, the mind and uprising, and this kind of thing. But one of the things I've tried to do when I've got involved in the political debates about the Ukraine war, I've tried to remain as much as possible a historian as well, right? And to choose my language carefully, yes, to try and be as neutral as as I can, to be as evidence driven as I can, and actually to try and present information and arguments which actually inform people. Yeah. So try and inform the debate as well as obviously adding a little bit of heat to it with my particular with my particular view. Okay. So there is these polarized narratives and views which don't communicate with each other very well. But it is possible. One has to try to actually find a kind of a language and formulations which at least the two sides can actually communicate to a certain degree. Yeah. So Putin, yeah, pretty. I would say for a politician, let's make sure that qualifier is there. is a pretty good historian. Of course, the other big history piece he wrote was this one about on the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine. Professionally, I'm not particularly well placed to judge that particular piece because my knowledge of ancient Russian and Ukrainian history is quite limited. Yeah, but what interested me about that piece was, Putin's kind of like historical explanation for the current moment we're in, because okay, so Putin explains his own actions by reference to security issues, by defending Russian civilization, its values, including Russians or pro-Russian people living in Ukraine. All kinds of like contemporary explanations he gives for what he does and for the war itself. But he also presents a general historical explanation for the war, for where we are now, right? And specifically in relation to the Ukraine war, right? Which is to do with the way modern Ukraine was constructed or reconstructed post the Russian Revolution, right? And he says the way it happened and the way the frontiers were drawn, right, had the effect, and also the policy of the Bolsheviks themselves in relation to the national question had the effect of, I think he says these are the words he used, of incubating a virulent Ukrainian nationalism, yeah, which then over time, and particularly in the post-Soviet period, becomes an anti-Russia project, right? i.e. the project of turning Russia into Ukraine into an anti-Russia. So Putin has a kind of long-term perspective. He has a short-term narrative. I had to go to war because it was a necessary thing to do at that moment. A medium-term perspective, NATO expansion and the way the West treated Russia, all this kind of thing. But he also has a long-term explanation, which is to do with the nature of the Ukrainian state as it emerged in the 20th century. Now, I'm not saying he's right or wrong about that, but it's interesting and it's indicative of how serious he is about history, right? And also, of course, the fact that this is historical perspective is very, very important in enabling us to understand Putin's actions, isn't it? Putin's thinking and what he might do in the future. And this leads me to another general point. Obviously, I'm very much involved in contesting these Russophobic, simplistic kind of like historical narratives and current narratives in relation to war in Ukraine. Spent a lot of my time in the last 3 years contesting those narratives, as have you and many other people. But I'm also mindful those narratives themselves can tell us a lot in explanatory terms, in explaining why the West is acting in the way that it is. I mean, how else can you explain this craziness that's going on at the moment about European rearmament, right? How would you explain that? And a confrontation with Russia, and all this talk about war with Russia in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. How do you explain that, right? Okay, you can explain it in various ways. Oh, it's just propaganda or it's just politics, but also it's because the way these political leaders, or at least some of them, and also the military people, are gripped by these narratives, these historical and current narratives. So they really do buy into the Hitler and appeasement narrative. And they really do buy into the idea that the last 20 years or so, we've been living through some kind of rerun of the 1930s, right? Or at least there's a good historical analogy between now and there. So all the while, we're contesting these narratives, and it's a big job because they're so ubiquitous. We have to be mindful about learning from them as well, in terms of our own understanding of what's going on at the present time.
Yeah, no, I noticed that as well. If you discuss anything about security competition, it usually doesn't take more than one or two sentences before someone delves into the 1930s. So this this that this is the only page in the history book we seemingly have now is quite dangerous. But I must say, I very much agree with you though. The different reasons why you need to know why it was worth reading Putin's account of history. For example, on how Ukraine has been used throughout history as an instrument
Yeah,
against Russia in the border region. Because,
sure.
also, as you said, for two reasons. One, if we can look through the historical evidence, it would be helpful if we all have a same, or at least to see what extent we can have a similar or a common historical understanding, so we live in the same reality.
Mm.
But the second is also to look, as you said, how then President Putin views the world, because you can see, well, let's say Germany is how he views Germany now, because Germany in World War One very much, looked to gain control over Ukraine, which could also be then used as an instrument against the Russians.
Mm.
World War Two, the same with their cooperation with different nationalist organizations, and now you see the Germans cooperating with the same groups yet again. So for the Russians, they can see this, the historical continuity that the Germans are kind of back at this. So when there's no, when they're drawing links back to the fascist and all, it's not just cheap slogans. They kind of they're genuinely convinced. If you see over the 100+ years, how this geographical region, the people living there, can be seen as a useful tool against them. It's very convincing. It's hard to imagine this not influencing, I guess, the political thinking in Moscow.
Yeah, sure. But I think the important point is that the thinking can change. It can shift. The historical narrative can change and shift as well, can't it? Yeah. So I don't see, what Putin or what the Russians are saying in relation to Germany at the present time as being immutable. It's very much driven by what the Germans are actually doing. Yeah. What the German government is saying, the current crop of German political leaders. There's a certain extent in which, these historical narratives or these narratives are kind of like very like powerful, compelling, and consequential, but also they're kind of like superficial. Yeah, in the sense that they and ephemeral, in the sense that they can be they can become less important, become kind of marginalized. Yeah, I mean we've been talking about the appeasement narrative here, but there's also two other strands of narrative which are all overlapping, which have I mean, for the discussion, the debate about the Ukraine war. I mean, the second one is what you might call, so it's the appeasement narrative. Then you have like the Cold War narrative, right, which sees what's going on now as being a kind of an extension or a repetition or something like that of the Soviet Western of the Soviet Western Cold War, and I think it's constructed very much in terms of liberalism versus authoritarianism. Now, the thing about that narrative is that that was prevalent long time before the Ukraine crisis broke out, right? And it was also present even before Russian-Western relations started to deteriorate in the early 2000s. But obviously, what gave it some purchase and some credibility was the events that happened subsequently, particularly in relation to Ukraine. Okay, and then the first, so appeasement and Cold War narrative, and then you have like what I call the Russophobic narrative, which is all about the narrative about deep Russian history, so called, yeah. This idea that Russia as a state, a civilization, has a particular character. It's authoritarian, it's expansionist, it's violent, right? It's different, it's Asiatic, it's barbarian, all of that, all of that kind of thing. Now that kind of narrative is kind of an eternal narrative, right? Goes back hundreds of years, in fact, right? But again, it's contemporary events and the way that it's linked to current narratives about recent events that has made it have more purchase in the present time. But as you say, the point you make, you said, well, surely when events change, then the narrative changes, the position changes, the perception changes. I think you're right. And I think that is what is going to happen. Yeah, I think there will be a shift. I'm not sure what shift because it depends on how the war pans out. But I think if for example, if this is hope speaking here rather than optimism, is that if there is some kind of agreed settlement of the Ukraine war in the short term, that will have a huge kind of impact on the purchase of these narratives we've been talking about. Because, if you have a peace settlement, no matter how onerous it might be as far as Ukraine is concerned, how do you explain the idea that you can't appease Putin, that he's bent on expansions when you've actually just done you've just had to deal with it. There's been some kind of stuff. So I think so at a certain point, reality does have the effect of collapsing, not collapsing, but eroding these narratives, or at least their power. So hopefully things are going to get better from our point of view in the not too distant future.
No, I agree though. I do think that identities, ideologies, narratives, they all reflect, the current distribution of power. But once realities change, it does take a while for the narratives to catch up, which is why it's dangerous when over the past 3 years here in the West that we had this relentless, overwhelming, powerful propaganda nonstop from morning to night. That
Yeah.
now that reality is changing fast, it's going to be very hard to shift this stories around because at least in this country, some are still talking about that Ukraine could be winning. It becomes
Right.
so far into alternate reality. But I just want to go into one thing because you did mention this idea that the Russian side is authoritarian aggressor, that this goes back hundreds of years, and
The idea of it, I wasn't saying it's true, by the way.
yeah,
The
no,
idea
no,
of it,
but
yeah,
this
sure.
dividing it to, the civilized Europeans, Asiatic
Yeah,
barbarians. I mean,
yeah,
this goes
yeah,
back a long, long time. What
sure.
was interesting in the World War II history, because on the topic of historical revisionism, I noticed something happening around 2008, 2009, which was more so than the before. It was that the Europeans especially began to refer to World War II as being started by not just the Nazis, but also the Soviets. And kind of they started to reimagine the whole war as being a conflict between democracies and totalitarian states. So suddenly, instead of the Soviets being with us on our side against the German Nazis, we kind of put them over that they kind of belong both in the same camp. They both started the conflict. And again, we back it up with, suddenly the Molotov-Ribbentrop will become, Pact becomes the, number
Yeah.
one evidence to support this new historical revisionism. I was wondering, if I can like, get your views on this, because this is something that pops up, I mean, like all the time.
Well, of course, as a historian, I started my professional life writing about the Nazi-Soviet Pact. I think I've written more about the Nazi-Soviet Pact than anyone else has ever written about it. So I was kind of I was shocked to see that all this stuff, these narratives, these arguments, which I thought I had refuted, banished, 30, 40 years ago, have now come back into the realm. Yeah, and I think you're right. Obviously, 2008, 2009 was a key moment because obviously you're coming up to the end of it. You got the Munich anniversary, of course, and then you've got the outbreak of World War II anniversary in 2000. I think that reflects the kind of growing influence of East European, Central European nationalists, Baltic nationalists, Polish nationalists, nationalists from other countries. That, of course, in many cases, talking about countries which were either fighting on the side of Nazi Germany, or there was huge collaboration with the Nazis, including the Holocaust, and of course that particularly applies to the books. So I think there's a political factor there, but also what was happening at the time, because in 2008, you get the Georgian, so-called Russo-Georgian War, don't you? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I think
Um,
that
and
contributed.
that feeds in, that puts life into this narrative about Russia's aggression. Now, of course, we know it wasn't the Russians that initiated those hostilities. It was the Georgians, and the Russians could have gone a lot further. They did, and then eventually they withdraw. But obviously the narrative grew up that this was a Russian attack on little Georgia. So the current real world event having an impact on this ideologically driven narrative, which is about the Nazis, the communists, Stalin, Hitler, they are all the same. Yeah. So this interaction between what the contemporary events and the what's the word, the purchase that historical narrative is a very important one. And of course that kind of argument, this stuff about the Nazi-Soviet Pact and all kinds of historical reference really coming to their own once we get to 2014 and the outbreak of the Ukraine crisis.
I think this historical hatred of Russia, it has a huge impact on the inability to find any peace in the Ukraine war, which is why I think we're going to end up in a very ugly peace or a bad peace. Because if you go back before 2014, the only thing the Russians asked for was neutrality in Ukraine. That is, don't make it part of NATO. Then after 2014, of course, they demanded the Crimea and also autonomy for Donbass in Minsk. After 2022, it escalates further. Then they recognize Donbass. Then later on, they also go with Zaporozhye and Kherson. And still, even now, there's no peace, and they can't win the war. And given that we don't want to talk, it looks like the Russians are now then increasing what they see as needing to control in the absence of a peace agreement, in which they will then move in towards Kharkov, maybe even Sumy, Dnipro, Nikolaev, Odessa. And if still there's no peace, I think they're just gonna destroy the infrastructure and make it a dysfunctional, chaotic, whatever remains, something that can't be used against them. This is just gonna be a horrible. Yeah, it's gonna be a nightmare for the Ukrainians. It's gonna be instability between the Europeans and the Russians for decades to come. It's just there's nothing there of value.
Which is why the Russians, Putin, needs to finish it and then quickly and do a deal if they possibly can, including a deal which would involve compromises on the Russian side. Because if they don't do that, they're going to be facing with the kind of scenario that you've just drawn, which isn't in their interests at all. And also that's a scenario which the anti-Russia Western narratives of their various guises will live on, and the policies they empower will live on. Will live on as well. There's nothing more than Western hardliners want was that is to fight the war to the very end, to the destruction of Ukraine, but then the struggle with Russia continues, right, on the basis of that destruction. But about Russophobia, the thing I think about Russophobia is that it's a very it's deep rooted and emotional in some senses, but as a general kind of phenomenon, it's very politically driven phenomenon, and because it's politically driven, it can like dissipate or weaken very quickly. And there's many examples in history where we had a flip around. You talked about Second World War. Of course, there's a very radical flip around, an undermining of Russophobia during the Second World War, during the Great Patriotic War, right? And the same, we mentioned Gorbachev earlier. The same applies in that period, the Russophobia. So Russophobia, it has been very powerful at the present moment, but that power can diminish quite radically. And also, we've seen what the possibilities are, haven't we, in relation to what's happening in the United States. Until a few months ago, we had what you could reasonably describe as a Russophobic US government, presidential administration, where Russophobic politicians were ruling the roost to one degree or another. That's changed radically, hasn't it? the last few months. And we have an administration that, at least collectively, has abandoned the Russophobia and wants to do deals with Russia, wants to establish a good working relationship with Russia. So that's a huge turnaround, isn't it? Okay, now maybe it won't last. Maybe there'll be reversion to a more anti-Russia policy. I don't know, but it shows you the potential for the way politics can shape the current moment, but it can also change the current moment if the politics itself undergoes transformation.
No, I think you're right. One shouldn't, yeah, get too, yeah, well, the the narratives can be changed, yeah. So
And also the important, I think, let's not, okay, let's not empower the narratives themselves by exaggerating their importance or their intractability. Yeah, look, they are a problem. We've been living in one for 3 years. You switch on the radio, the TV, you read the newspapers, you got these narratives hitting you all the time. Of course, one gets an impression of how powerful and compelling they are, and one can see how they do actually have real world impacts on policy. But let's not get too carried away about their strength and see the possibilities that they can be. These narratives, well, not can be, they are being undermined. Yeah, in the last year or two, they have been undergoing a process of erosion. For the reasons you said earlier, because real world events keep intruding and undermining the preferred narrative.
well, on those wise words, we can yeah, wrap this up. So yeah, thank you so much, and yeah, I look forward to speaking with you soon.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.